To understand what a secondary dominant chord is, we first have to understand what a regular dominant chord is. The dominant chord is the fifth chord of the key, and it functions to resolve us back neatly to the tonic chord, the 1 chord. Particularly when this chord has a dominant 7th on it, it creates this natural pull to resolve to the chord a fifth away. So that's a normal dominant chord, but what's a secondary dominant chord? Well, if the normal dominant chord is the chord that resolves us back to the tonic from 5 to 1, the secondary dominants are the chords that can resolve us to all of the other chords in the key. For example, if we were in the key of G major, and we want a chord to resolve us to the 6th chord of the key, E minor, we can use the dominant chord which is a fifth away from that destination of E minor, which is a B7 chord. This is exactly what happens in the chorus of All You Need Is Love. You can hear how the B7 pulls us up onto the E minor chord. The B7 is acting as a secondary dominant. All you need is love. If this chord was instead a B minor, it would still be a nice chord progression, but it wouldn't have that sense of tension and release. It wouldn't be functioning as a dominant chord. All you need is love. Another song to use this particular type of secondary dominant chord, the major version of the 3 chord, is Billie Eilish's Happier Than Ever. This time we're in the key of C major. We can see the same resolution though from the major version of the 3 chord, in this case E7, to the 6th chord of the key, A minor.
I'm happier than ever. Wish I could explain it better.
This chord change has been used in countless songs. We can see it here in First Day of My Life by Bright Eyes.
This is the first day of my life.
And it's also used here in ABBA's Dancing Queen. But of course, this is only one type of secondary dominant chord. We can use a secondary dominant chord to resolve to any of the chords of the key. If we want to resolve to the 5th chord of the key, for example, we once again just have to use the dominant chord, which is a fifth away from that destination chord. So on this occasion, it winds up being the major version of the 2 chord. We can see this secondary dominant in 9 to 5 by Dolly Parton. 9 to 5 is in the key of F sharp major, so the secondary dominant that will deliver us to the 5th chord of the key, C sharp, is the major version of the 2 chord, G sharp 7. Just like the previous second dominant chord we were looking at, this is a really common chord choice that we can find in a wide variety of songs. It's used here in Billy Joel's Piano Man.
I'm not really sure how it goes, but it's sad and it's sweet.
And here in Buddy Holly's That Will Be the Day.
Still you tell me maybe that someday, well, I'll be blue, well, that'll be the day.
All of the examples we've looked at so far have been in the major key, and this is typically the most likely place you'll find secondary dominants at work. But secondary dominants can be used in the minor key. For example, here on their track Time Is Running Out, Muse used the major version of the 2 chord, but in the minor key. The chord is still working as a secondary dominant though, delivering us to the 5th chord of the key. So we've now looked at the secondary dominant that takes you to the 6th chord, the secondary dominant that takes you to the 5th chord, but what if we want to go to the 4th chord of the key? Well, as always, we just need the dominant chord that's a fifth away from the destination. To get to the 4 chord, it actually winds up being the dominant chord built on the 1st degree of the key. This is exactly what happens in Hey Jude by the Beatles. The middle 8 section of Hey Jude begins on the 4th chord of the key, B flat. So at the end of the verse, Paul switches us from the regular tonic chord, F major, to the dominant 7th version of that chord, F7, which points us towards that 4th chord of the key. It works as a secondary dominant.
to make it better. Anytime you feel the pain, ain't true.
Delilah by Tom Jones is another good example of this dominant 1 chord, but here used in a minor key. Here we're in the key of A minor, so when the music switches to the A7 chord, this is our secondary dominant, taking us to the 4th chord of the key, D minor.
She was my woman.
Songs will often use more than one type of secondary dominant chord. For example, Don't Think Twice It's Alright by Bob Dylan uses both the major 2 chord here to take us to the 5 chord, and also the dominant 1 chord here to take us to the 4 chord.
It ain't no use sitting and wonder why, girl. You don't ever do somehow. When your rooster crows at the break of dawn, look out your window and I'll be gone.
So we've seen 3 different types of secondary dominant chord so far. The major 3 chord that resolves us to the 6th chord of the key, the major 2 chord that resolves us to the 5th chord of the key, and the dominant 1 chord that resolves us to the 4th chord of the key. But as I mentioned before, we've got 2 more types of secondary dominant to look at. If we wanted to resolve to the 2nd chord of the key, we can use the dominant chord a 5th away from that chord, which winds up being the major version of the 6th chord. So for example, in the key of G major, to wind up on the 2 chord of A minor, we use the major version of the 6th chord, E7. And this is exactly what happens in Big Girls Don't Cry by Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons.
Big girls, they don't cry.
Now, this particular type of secondary dominant chord is a less common choice today and is mostly found in songs that came out before the 1990s. We can see it here in Maxwell's Silver Hammer by the Beatles.
Back in school again, Maxwell plays the fool again, teacher gets annoyed.
And also here in How Deep Is Your Love by the Bee Gees.
Your eyes in the morning sun, I feel you touch me.
So now we have just one last type of secondary dominant chord to talk about. The secondary dominant chord that delivers you to the 3rd chord of the key. And this winds up being the major version of the 7th chord of the key. This is perhaps the rarest of all of the secondary dominant chords, but it does certainly get used. A great example of it in action is in Bohemian Rhapsody. At this point in the song, we're in the key of E flat major. So this D major chord here is the major version of the 7 chord, a secondary dominant, that delivers us to the 3rd chord of the key, G minor. We can also see this particular type of secondary dominant at work in Mr. Sandman. Here we're in the key of A major, so this G sharp 7 chord is the secondary dominant taking us to the 3rd chord of the key, C sharp. However, what's really interesting about this song is that the C sharp is also a secondary dominant, which takes us to the 6th chord of the key, which is also a secondary dominant. So that in turn takes us to the next chord, and so on. This song is actually built from a long chain of secondary dominants, giving it a super satisfying chord progression.
Mr. Sandman, bring me a dream, make him the cutest that I've ever seen. Give him 2 lips like roses and clover, and tell him that his lonesome nights are...
Chaining secondary dominants together into these sequences can be a particularly common technique in older music. The bridge of the classic jazz standard I've Got Rhythm by George Gershwin is a series of secondary dominants which each resolve neatly into the next.
Could ask for anything more, old man trouble. I don't mind if you won't find him around my door.
The same progression, albeit in a different key, is actually used in the bridge of Be My Baby by the Ronettes. Now, as you may have already noticed in this video, secondary dominants almost always have a dominant seventh on them. They're not just major chords, they're seventh chords. The presence of the seventh degree in the chord really hits home that secondary dominant function. It introduces more tension that makes the chord really want to resolve onto its destination, a fifth away. However, even though the inclusion of a dominant seventh in the chord does really bring out that secondary dominant function, it's not compulsory. You can have a secondary dominant chord that doesn't have a seventh on it. For example, in the pre-chorus of Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, we're in the key of B flat major. So this C chord is the major version of the 2 chord, and is acting to resolve us onto the 5th chord of the key, F. It's working as a secondary dominant. However, it doesn't include that dominant 7th degree. As you can hear, we still get that sense of the C resolving us to F, but that secondary dominant function is not as potent as it would be if they had included the 7th degrees in these chords. Heart of Glass by Blondie is another example of a secondary dominant chord which omits the 7th degree. This F sharp chord at the end of the bridge is a secondary dominant, taking us to the 5th chord of the key, B. And one last element of secondary dominance that I want to clear up before the end of the video is that they don't actually have to resolve to the chord a fifth away. So far in this video, every example we've looked at has been a secondary dominant chord resolving neatly in a perfect cadence movement to the chord a fifth away. And this is certainly the most common use of a secondary dominant chord, but in the same way that the normal dominant chord of the key, the 5 chord, doesn't have to resolve to 1, neither does a secondary dominant chord. For example, in Creep, this B chord is a secondary dominant. It's the major version of the 3 chord. Now, typically, this secondary dominant, the B chord in the key of G major, would resolve to E minor, the 6th chord of the key, like this. What the hell am I doing here? But instead, the chord change that we actually get is the B chord resolving to the C major chord, the 4th chord of the key. What the hell am I doing here? As you can hear, this does provide a certain level of resolution, but not a complete resolution. And for this reason, this cadence is often called an interrupted cadence, or a deceptive cadence, as it diverges from the more typical and predictable perfect cadence that we've been looking at so far in this video. Secondary dominants are one of those music theory concepts where, even if you're not familiar with what they are, you have almost definitely used them before. For something with such a technical sounding name, secondary dominant, they're actually so common in music. So if you can think of any other examples of secondary dominants in songs that you love, then do leave them in the comments down below. And as always, a massive thanks goes to everyone who supports me on Patreon, including the names you see on screen right now, and Andre Sainz Diaja, Andy Deacon, Andrew Brown, Andrew Sussman, Austin Barrett, Austin Russell, Bob McKinstry, Boo Medell, Whitney Parker, Cameron Allvilla, Colin Aiken, Chris Cabal, Christopher Ryan, David Bennett is hot, David Rivers, Donald Howard, Dr. Darren Wicks, Elena Skorchenko, Eugene Leroy, FD Hodor, Greg Kabowski, Ilamo Latona, Hamish Brocklebank, Hernick Kutcher, Hugo Miller, Ivan Pang, Jake Fisher, James Ko, J.A. Kokensparger, John Dye, Josh Sanderlin, Justin Vigor, Mark Siegenhagen, Max O'Keefe, Melody Composer Squared, Melanie Schonert, Michael Vivian, Nancy Gillard, Nathan Lawrence, Nathaniel Park, Nick Chang, Paul Middleton, Paul Muller, Paul Pazel, Peter Dunphy, Richard Gride, Roger Clay, John Kennedy, Steve Daly, Stephen Lazaro, Tim Beaker, Homer Aharoni, Trisha Adams, Tim Payne, Victor Levy, Vidad Flowers, Vladimir Kodakov, Volti, Waylon Fairbanks, and Zayfod.